Jamie Scott, welcome back to the podcast. I think you may be in a very top tier level of people, not only because of who you are as a human and your broad yet deep base of knowledge on the topics that we're going to be talking about today, but also because you are in, I think, a very unique club. People who've been over on the podcast over 3 times.
Is it 3 or 2? I thought
No, this is technically your 4th episode with me, I think.
4th. What
Yeah.
happened? Okay, I'll take your word for it.
It might even be the 5th. I'd have to go back and check. But
I was
yeah,
I was trying to figure this out today. I was like, oh no, we've definitely done the last time we recorded a big one. We split it in 2.
we did. We did split it in 2. So I consider that 2 episodes because we went on a journey on the, on that podcast. And it's really funny because now I'm starting to see more people talking about energy flux. And that's ironic because we talked about that, I think, a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago.
Like another lifetime ago, doesn't it?
Pretty much. But today we are going to we're gonna wade into it. We're gonna talk about the thing.
The thing.
One of the things that in 2023 has been on so many people's lips, a topic of conversation. It's not cold plunging, which has also somehow had this surge in 2023, but it is everyone's favorite thing to talk about now. And we're going to be discussing this in more detail because, as you know, when things get popular or more people start talking about it, we see all sorts of wacky things happen. Just not understanding what things are, totally exaggerating stuff, missing the big point, you name it. So, what are we going to talk about today?
Zone 2 training.
No, zone 2 cardio. Oh my goodness. Yes, we are going to talk about zone 2 cardio. So I would love if you would, for the listener, sort of talk about, we've been on the podcast before. We've talked about strength training. We've talked about nutrition, but I would love for you to share with the listener your experiences sort of working with people in terms of cardio or endurance training, just so we have a bit of a basis to go forward from. And then I'm sure we will jump off into several subtopics, and probably this will need to be two episodes, but we'll see.
See where we end up.
Yeah.
My experience training people, I think through virtue of my kind of background, I have worked with a lot more endurance based individuals rather than the strength side of which I know you kind of tend to sit on much more than what I have historically. Predominantly, I think just because of my interest, it's been mostly cyclists, but not exclusively. And so over the years, I've worked with road cyclists, track cyclists in particular, and more recently, kind of gravity-based cycling, so mountain bikers, enduro, downhill, cross country. So in that sort of space, and a few runners from half to full marathons, right all the way out to kind of ultra distance runners who are doing the kind of 100-mile type events. So that's kind of the main kind of scope of the people that I work with, and they kind of run the full gamut. Like I've worked with those who have gone on to kind of do national representation, and I've worked with those who are just kind of starting out, really. So I've kind of seen the full range of people who are just doing things as a hobby and as a passion versus those who it's their job to ride and perform and get results. So I kind of that's the scope of the people that I work with, and across that scope, obviously, there's across those different disciplines. So like you can talk about the cyclists and go, okay, they all ride bikes, but some ride bikes for 2 minutes, some ride bikes for 24 hours sometimes, like depending on what the event is. And then you've got individuals within that. And so like you're taking kind of endurance training, which we can run into the problem of referring to as this single entity, but it's not. Like, it is many different things. Like, it comes down to the time code of which you're dealing with someone. So I mean, technically, I think from a technical standpoint, or at least a physiological standpoint, endurance becomes anything over 45 seconds. So when you're working with track cyclists who are sprinters, the moment they're doing an event that's 60 plus seconds, they're automatically an endurance athlete. So that's kind of the background of people that I tended to work with. Again, not exclusively. I've got some random folk in there. I've got like roller derby athletes, and this, that, and next thing. People have kind of come in from left field every now and then, and you have to kind of stretch the brain and go, okay, well, how do I make this work for those individuals?
Yeah, I can really relate to sort of the breadth of cyclists that you've worked with, because although I've never raced track, I have learned to ride on the track, which is its own thing. But, from a perspective of my past with mountain biking and using road riding as a supplement to that, and then doing some shoulder season stuff with cyclocross and whatnot. I mean, I've done everything from racing downhill mountain bikes, like you were talking about, those sort of shorter, although the downhill tracks can vary in length, but those sort of shorter duration races versus the 12-hour solos, the 24-hour solos, or on teams, and those really long pursuits. When I was first mountain biking and really got into it in about 2004 was when I first got my first real mountain bike, my Gary Fisher Hukui Ku, from Bicycles Unlimited. And I just, kind of got bit by the bug and entered my first local competition. I didn't know anything about that kind of training. And yet at the same time, as I got more into the sport and I realized I had to train if I wanted to be good or get better, the idea of building a cardiovascular base or building an aerobic base was something that was very much talked about. And so I'm curious, from your perspective, if we're going back basically 20 years at this point, why do you think Zone 2 has, and we'll kind of talk about what it is here in a second, but why do you think it has become this, is having this moment of resurgence? It's having this moment in the spotlight when truly it's not a new concept.
Jesus, like, that's the laughable thing. We're all suddenly kind of jumping on this Zone 2 bandwagon as if it's the latest thing to come out of sports science. I'm like, oh my God. I mean, I did my exercise, my sport and exercise science degree in the 90s, and that, it was old news at that point. It was just framed differently. I mean, I think you referred to it there. It was base training, aerobic base training. And I mean, I can't kind of say exactly when this could have came to the fore, but I mean, I certainly know it was, as a training technique, it was probably the 60s or 70s, if not before then, that there was this kind of notion that you had to build a big base, and that's what your off season was you go out and do base training or long, slow distance, or however it was framed. Jump forward to where we are now, and I know that in recent years there's been a much greater focus on polarized training. Again, we'll probably kind of unpack that as we get into the podcast. And an aspect of that kind of polarized training is breaking your training down into zones, and they could be anything from 3 zones, 5 zones, 6 zones, 7 zones. They're all over the show. But the central premise is that you do training at low intensity, whatever that intensity happens to be, and you do training at high intensity, and you can distribute your training loads across those two kind of polar extremes, and kind of cut some of the volume from the middle out. Just so happens that I think in recent times, for whatever reason, unbeknownst to me, is that in the last year, 2 years, how long this has been resurfacing, is that Zone 2, as part of that kind of polarization, has really kind of gained popularity amongst kind of everyday folk wanting to do their own kind of health and fitness journey.
Mm.
But it's by no means a new topic by any stretch of the imagination. It's been around decades.
No, I wonder to what degree social media. We always seem to talk about social media and touch on it on some level on pretty much every podcast I do with a guest, whether it's how we came to know of each other or, and that's, truly the case here, but it's concepts, it's sort of the things that we're struggling with to apply, whatever it is. I think the social media aspect has, and now I'm thinking about it, has helped to sort of help things lodge in terms of what's popular and create a lot of chatter, for lack of a better term. I mean, you used to just have cycling coaches, if we're talking about cycling here, right? Cycling coaches talking about this stuff and then obviously giving that to their clients. But maybe you would have researchers publishing their work. Maybe, things would show up here and there on early forms of blogs, perhaps. But it wasn't, you just didn't have the sheer volume of discussion about these things. And I think that creates that groundswell that can tip something into sort of that, was it early majority, where we're sort of like seeing more and more and more people are talking about this. And so we think, oh, this is the new big popular thing. And it was kind of the same way with HIIT training, 10 years ago.
Totally. Yeah.
Right. And so now we just have more people publishing content, more people talking about it. And so we almost have this perception of something's importance or it's this new thing. And in reality, it's maybe just more content being shared around these topics, which ironically we're doing here right now on this podcast.
And you need one or two very popular talking heads, so we've got a really strong platform to kind of drop this concept, and it will spread like wildfire from there. And I think that's kind of what's happened, not just with Zone 2 training, but you know yourself that in recent times there's been more and more discussions around creatine, and I know like that's a discussion that you've kind of led with, and women's training and so on. Like it only takes one or two key influences to mention it, and boom, it's off.
Mm-hmm.
But these are concepts that have been, as I said, they've been around for decades, and they come and go in cycles. And I think you and I have been around the block enough times now in our kind of individual careers to kind of see some of these things resurface for not just the second time round, but the third time round and the fourth time round. Like, oh, here we go again on this roundabout. So it's.
Yeah, we were doing ice baths and stuff and, we'd have some pretty brutal squatting sessions. And so we'd go home and do ice baths or contrast showers, and again, those concepts are nothing new. That was 10, 12 years ago. And now again, seeing it come back, it's sort of like an every decade sort of thing, it seems.
On that topic, I mean, I had a brief involvement with the New Zealand track cycling squad for a while, and the squad of sprinters that I was an assistant helper coach general dog's body with, we'd go away to big track meets, and in between, say, a morning session or an evening session or an overnight session, we would be doing hot colds. We'd be in a hotel room somewhere, we'd go down to some sort of local quickie mart and buy a kid's rubber plastic paddling pool, set that up in the middle of the hotel/motel, go and raid the local service station for every bag of ice that they possibly had, fill that up, and we would be running the athletes between the ice bath and a hot shower doing contrast training. This was 2004. Like, oh my God, that's 20 years ago. So, nothing's new.
No, nothing's new. All right. So let's kind of back up a sec and define or discuss, if we will, what is Zone 2 training and what are some other names that people might hear associated with this or other terms? Because I feel like this can get a little bit muddy for folks because they're hearing different words, different terms used to describe this general concept of training. and thinking they're different things, but really they're flavors of the same.
This is a tricky one, actually, because as I said earlier on, there's multiple different zones. And I mean, I guess, like, to back it up a little bit, the broad theory is that we have different metabolic responses happening at different levels of intensity of exercise. And each one of these zones, which invariably are heart rate based zones, broadly represent a switch from one state or stage of our metabolism up to kind of the next as we go up the line, starting from very low aerobic lipid based or fat burning based metabolism through to aerobic glycolytic type metabolism or glucose burning metabolism, through to now you're starting to progress into very high end aerobic / a little bit anaerobic, all the way up to anaerobic, full on, I'm about to die type metabolism. And, we've kind of sliced that into kind of nice, neat heart rate zones. So from this heart rate zone to that heart rate zone, you transition. And, like, they're a bit kind of fuzzy, really, as to what these zones actually are. And they're just a proxy for different physiological transition points going on, or thresholds, as we often call them. So, under your lactate threshold, you're considered to be kind of more aerobic, and then over a lactate threshold, you're considered to be starting to go more anaerobic. We can talk about ventilatory thresholds, and sometimes, we talk about lactate threshold and the first ventilatory threshold being kind of the same thing. So, so there's just kind of different ways of slicing our overall metabolism up. And I think that schema of representing our intensities into these nice, neat, tidy zones, I think the tide's going out on that from what I've seen. We're not kind of in these nice, neat little boxes. We have this ability to operate across a very broad range of intensities, and the balance of how we are supplying fuel and oxygen and everything else that we need to kind of maintain whatever output it is that we're doing, the balance will kind of subtly shift as it needs to. There's not a kind of a hard and fast, this is your aerobic fat burning zone, this is your glycolytic zone, this is your anaerobic zone. There's just one massive zone, and the body's just doing what the hell it needs to try and catch up and supply whatever it needs to supply into the system. That's kind of, when we talk about zone 2 training, that is generally, I think, referred to as part of a 5-zone system, or like 5 to 6 zone system. But there are other systems out there where they kind of go up to kind of zone 7, which is, I think, kind of alactic neurological type short burst high intensity type stuff. But the zone 2 training, the zones that I myself tend to use with my clients, I use just to confuse the situation even more, I use a 3-zone system. My influence from the physiological side of it has been through Professor Stephen Seiler, who I think is from Texas originally, but now he's based out of Norway. And he's kind of, I don't think he likes this reference, but he's kind of seen as the modern godfather of polarized training. And I think my guess would be that some of the work that he and his team has done recently, not just exclusive to him, but some of the work that he's done around kind of low intensity training and polarized training has kind of brought this kind of whole zone 2 stuff back to the fore. And, it's come under various guises. I mean, we've already said that it's, you can refer to it as zone 2, you can refer to it as base training, you can refer to it as low intensity training, you can refer to it as long, slow distance training, even though that's not technically true. That kind of leads people up a garden path. You can refer to it as your first ventilatory threshold training. There's a myriad of things out there, but I think zone 2 is kind of the most popular name and stuff.
For sure. And I think that's in our zest as humans to want to understand things and put them into nice, neat, tidy boxes is great because we're trying to define things and understand the parameters. And then, of course, people like you and I are trying to help the good people out there listening to this podcast who maybe want to improve their cardiovascular fitness, or you're training your athletes in cycling or whatever it happens to be. Where you and I are really functioning in that sort of space of trying to help people apply things and to coach actual humans, which we know is very complex. And it's not as simple as you just need to give somebody a clear number, because depending on the person, there could be a lot of factors that influence, for example, where their zone 2 is. But I think that a great analogy might be something like the spectrum of how we train our muscles, right? And especially when we look at things like hypertrophy training, right? That we used to think that hypertrophy training had a very distinct sort of reps, sets, etc. And it was sort of in this nice, neat, from this number of reps to this number of reps. And then anything lower than that is, of course, your strength and in slash power. And then anything higher than that is your muscular endurance. But I think what we've seen through the more recent research and sort of put syntheses of all this information is that it's a spectrum. You know, maybe some people have a bit more propensity to also be able to put on muscle in more strength ranges. And so we have this idea that things are a little bit more fluid than we previously thought or expected them to be. And I think I hear something very similar in what you're just saying, which is we have all of these ways that we want to put numbers and quantify and put parameters on the spectrum of cardiovascular fitness and expression, and how the different really complex ways our metabolism changes to meet the stimulus. But then when we try to give that to humans and help them apply it, it can get kind of messy. And I think that that's where people like you and me see our clients, our athletes, the people we talk to get confused and want to focus super hard on the exact numbers. And then they see conflicting numbers and then they're off on a spiral somewhere.
Like it's been a very interesting journey for me, because I mean, I came very much from the sports science background. So I did my training in an exercise physiology lab, and that was that exercise physiology was my favorite subject. That was the one I was good at. And so I exited university, I think, with that very kind of scientific mindset of like, let's just grab a human being and we will kind of measure them backwards, forwards, inside out, and upside down, and get all the numbers. We'll test their lactate threshold. We'll get this. We'll get the VO2. Blah 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 blah. And it's just a paint by numbers. All you need to do is go, here's your numbers. Train at this heart rate. Bob's your auntie, and call it good. But then you realize in the real world that humans are messy, aren't they? So you end up kind of going, okay, it's somewhere between coaching humans in the real world in a nice applied way is part science and part art. And I think as I've gotten older, not to kind of diminish the science behind it, because both you and I really try and keep up with that and be evidence-based / evidence-informed, but you realize like there's a real art to it, and that art is kind of a bit fuzzy. We deal with kind of broad ranges rather than absolutes. It's like, well, to use your example, your rep range might be somewhere between here and here, and that's like a really broad, wide parameter you've just given someone. And people struggle with that that kind of broadness and fuzziness of the application and the whole, well, context matters or it depends. Because I think we've kind of developed this mindset, partly through the democratization of the whole sports science thing, that magic happens at a set heart rate or like some sort of set number. And that magic at a set number has been reinforced by the fact that we've all got kind of real-time heart rate monitoring now. We're all kind of wearing some sort of thing that, back in the day where if you, got one of those. Back in the day and you'll remember this too, it's like if you wanted to monitor your heart rate, you put the bloody strap on and half the time you'd end up out the door and down the road and like, oh, forgot my heart rate monitor. Oh, too bad. But now it's all there and we can slice and dice the data and people want to know the exact number. However, the trends that I'm seeing, and I'm kind of pleased that some of the top minds in these fields, again, like my kind of key influencers, some of these top professors who have come out and said the feeling of a particular intensity is actually probably more important than the number. And you and I have both kind of with our individual clients, we use a lot of kind of feeling in terms of perceived exertion. What is your RPE? Like how hard does this feel to you? How many reps do you think you've got left in the tank? And it's all like, it's a warm, fuzzy feeling. I think I've got 3 reps left, or I think this is a 6 out of 10, or I think I'm at a 3 out of 10 intensity. And that, like, it just ends up being a real mind fuck for a lot of people because they don't like that. They just like, tell me what heart rate I need to be at. It's like, there isn't a heart rate. It's broad. Some days your heart rate's going to be higher. Some days it's going to be lower. Like, just go out and, get the feeling. And yes, there's some things that you can wrap around that and go, like, it's going to be somewhere between this feeling and this type of breathing and this range of heart rate, and triangulate those and whatever your pace or power or happens to be on the day. Like, it's somewhere in the middle of that. Go out and learn what you've got on any given day.
Mm-hmm.
It gets messy for people.
It does. It does, but
tell me how to train.
It's tough. It walks that line between, especially when people are newer, helping them understand how to train by something like an RPE or how to use auto regulation is difficult. And even though we have good evidence-based backup to say, hey, training with RPE in terms of endurance and cardio pursuits is a great validated way to train, and also for strength training. And I don't think people realize that RPE has been validated in scientific studies for specifically strength training. And that's great. But for a newer trainee, it's you're throwing a lot at them, right? It's sort of saying, okay, hey, we're going to, if we're taking the strength training element here, we're talking about the actual mechanics of the movement itself and trying to have good mechanics. And we're maybe tossing in some tempo there. And, you've got rest periods and you've got reps and sets, and now how to figure all of that out. And that's why I tell people quite upfront in Strong with Steph, hey, if you're going to use RPE and you're new to it, expect that the first 2, maybe 3 months even, it's all a learning process. And if you stick with it and you don't give up out of frustration because you just want a percentage, or you want somebody to give you, hey, today you're going to do 20 pounds, no matter how you feel on this, shoulder press, you're going to do 20 pounds. That might not work for that person on that day, but really trying to understand. And I think this is where you and I are very similar, trying to understand how to bring together, yes, quantitative data, there's value in that, but also bring in that autoregulation piece and marry them together and find where the overlap is and find out how to leverage both. Gives people the best long-term runway for their training. And I don't think that that's super popular, or I just think people, again, quite understandably, just tell me the number that I'm going to see on my Garmin, or I'm going to see on my Fitbit, or whatever they're using, as that we have that democratization of fitness technology and those sorts of things. Because I think we remember a day where you couldn't really measure your HRV very easily, right? There was just really no way to do that in an easy way. And now pretty much every device has the ability to measure HRV and display it, whether it's real time or it's being used in an algorithm. But that's the tough part. And I think that's one of the key points of this episode is, and we'll probably get into this a bit deeper, but when I talk with people, I'm sure when you talk with people, they're like, I just don't, just give me the heart rate zone. And we're both there kind of going, yeah. And, you
Yeah.
know,
Like
you
it's
know,
interesting too because it's I mean you kind of touched on it there briefly. Is that there's a learning phase you have to go through. You know, there's phases of training, and oh, Jesus, for as long as I can remember now, I have tried to teach people that you have to go through the training to train phase. And that is where you are learning the art and science of training as it pertains to you, your body, your life, your context, your sport, whatever else. But people kind of want to go, well, I want to skip that step and I just want to get to the train to achieve the result, where the result can be some performance based or body composition type result. I just want that right now. I don't want to have to go through 3 months, 6 months, 2 years, or however long it takes to acquire the knowledge and skills of how my body works. That's your job. Just give me the number and I'll do that and we'll call it good. And it's like, no, you can't skip that step. Like even with us as coaches, like we can, because we see so many people and you get kind of that pattern recognition that goes with that. You can take an educated guess as to roughly what someone needs to be doing or what direction they need to point in, but we still don't really fully know until we start to work with them. So there's that kind of early stage where as we hold their hand, it's like the individual is learning what works for them and we're also learning what works for them. And it's not a stage that you can shortcut, and it's not a paint by numbers job where you just go, okay, you're a woman of this age, therefore your magic number that you train at is this one. Go to it. It just doesn't work that way. Sorry.
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Big disappointment to lots of people, but it just doesn't work that way.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of learning, training to train, or learning the key skills that you need to be able to leverage that into long-term success, whatever your goal is. And it's not a quick process. And I think the unfortunate part is that the way fitness is sold to people is, here's this 4-week boot camp and you're going to get in the best shape of your life, and just, short, hard, fast, you're going to get the result. And also the implication is you're going to be able to maintain that result, which is not the case, right? We're just going to detrain or whatever gains we got, whatever improvements we had, we will adapt to the lack of stimulus, right? And so we'll have that atrophy. We'll see the deconditioning, right? So we had to continue the training, but I think that is a huge skill set. And if we can lean into that a bit more, anyone listening to this is saying like, hey, don't expect these miraculous, huge results, especially whether it's with conditioning or it's with muscle development or strength gain. These things take time, and you kind of have to settle into that. And like you said, be a great learner. Shane Farmer, who's another friend of mine, who's a rowing coach, we recorded another episode of the podcast, and he was echoing that exact same thing. We need to be lifelong learners if we want this idea of some component of fitness because we really enjoy it or we have a specific goal for a long term. So I appreciate that. I think that it would be helpful now that we've given our sort of preamble here, and this is important stuff because so often I think people are looking for only the information, or they're saying, tell me the physiology, or why does this matter to me? And that is an important part of the conversation. But I think that as we bring in our coaching experience and working with people, we can give a fuller picture of the implementation as well. But let's maybe back it up a bit and talk about what are some of the specific benefits of something like a zone 2 training, if we're going to call it that in this episode, that are unique to that type of physiological response, and why, if somebody is endurance training or they want to improve their conditioning, that's a necessary piece of the puzzle.
I mean, it's a great question. Again, I don't think people necessarily like the answer to it, but if like rather than kind of frame things as zone two, like I think it might be a little bit easier for people to understand that we're effectively talking about doing some type of low intensity training, some sort of high intensity training. Like those are kind of the polarized options that seem to be kind of gaining, more popularity and more recognition in the general population. And so the debate that rages is, do you do your training as low intensity, or do you do your training as high intensity? And that's kind of flipped on its head over the years. The reality is that the Venn diagram of the benefits of doing each overlaps really, really heavily. So if we were starting to talk about mitochondrial function, cardiovascular function, capillary density, muscle enzymes, like the whole lot, like the high intensity achieves a good portion of that, the low intensity achieves a good portion of that. And so there's a massive, massive overlap there. I don't think it's necessarily helpful for most people to try and decide which of those two camps that they need to be in based on the mechanistic side of it, or the physiology of going, well, if I do this kind of gives me that, and so on, because they both overlap, but they're both complementary. You kind of need both to achieve the totality of the picture. To so a case of the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Like you kind of need both there. It's useful to, I think of the low intensity training as having the total effect of raising kind of the floor of your fitness, whereas the high intensity work tends to kind of lift the ceiling of your fitness. And so you can get fitter by creating a higher ceiling or building more capacity in that direction. But you can also bring your baseline up from doing the low intensity training as well. Ultimately, you're trying to balance which one of those camps, or like how much volume you do with one or the other. And I think that's where people will get lost, and where some of the debates rage, because people are like, oh, no, you need to do like mostly high intensity training. Oh, no, you need to do mostly low intensity training. And then you get into the arguments of, well, why would one person do this and why would one person do that? And kind of more recently, we've kind of heard some of the arguments around sex differences around, which direction you go in. And that's becomes very, very confusing for people. So, probably dodge the initial question there a little bit, but in terms of the overall benefits, I think, again, reading the tea leaves a little bit on some of the more recent discussions that I've seen. There's been a big focus on mitochondrial function, and mitochondria being kind of the powerhouses of our cells, effectively kind of, I don't know, the battery of our cells that kind of generate the energy that allows us to kind of do the thing that we want to do, run up hills, ride bikes, do whatever it happens to be. So there's a big focus on either low intensity or high intensity training, developing our mitochondrial capacity in one way, shape, or form. And then, and you'd need to get a completely different guest on for that, because I now sit more on the applied side of things rather than the physiological side of things, like to start to unwrap what mitochondrial function is and what happens in the mitochondria when you are creating these stimuluses from the different training is just, you can get lost in the weeds on that really quickly.
Yeah, it's complicated. It's sort of like when we see out in the world the so-called hormone balancing coaches. And we kind of think, in order to actually fully understand these different hormonal cascades or different metabolic connections in the body are incredibly complicated, incredibly complex. And the biochemistry is not something I even pretend to have a full grasp on. And at the same time, it seems like sometimes when we're pointing out, okay, this perhaps this transporter is upregulated, or, these enzymes are upregulated, or whatever it happens to be, is that people will hone in on that and not necessarily pull back and think about things again in terms of the practical application. So I think that that's sort of where some of the disconnect comes in, which is like, great to have the it's great to talk about those mechanisms, but again, at the end of the day, and how do we then take that information and apply it to humans in a training capacity, such that we're helping the right people do the right things that they need for themselves, and we're not missing the message somehow and saying, for example, zone 2 isn't really necessary for this type of person, or you should only be doing zone 5, or zone 3 is completely useless. We get these sort of very broad brushstroke messages that then end up, to certain groups of people, seeming like, well, I don't need to do this, or this is harming me in some way. And I think that's where things get a little bit lost.
Yeah, totally. There's I mean, again, we're coming back to the point that it's not one or the other, it's both. Like, whether we call it zone 2 and zone 5, or low intensity and high intensity, you need both, ideally. How are you going to balance that out? Well, that depends. I think people fall into the trap of what I call the tyranny of the 7-day cycle, where they kind of go, okay, like, every week, how do I balance out my low intensity with my high intensity? Like, do I have the time, whatever else? It's like, nothing needs to be balanced on a per weekly basis. There's very little, if anything at all, about human physiology, which runs on kind of 7-day cycles. That's a social construct more than anything else. You could balance your high intensity and low intensity work over a month, over a much, much larger block. It could be a season. You could do your low intensity over winter and your high intensity over summer, or vice versa, depending on your environment and what suits. You could do it over years if necessary. And certainly there are different types of athletes who do that, where they might go through, say on an Olympic cycle, they might go, okay, I'm going to spend the next year doing predominantly low intensity work, and the keyword is there, predominantly. But in this phase of my Olympic build-up, I'm going to switch over and I might do a big block of more kind of high intensity type work. Like, it just depends. Like, the way you can slice and dice these intensity distributions really comes down to the individual and what their goal are, and what their capacity is, and everything else. And again, it's just not neat and tidy for people. And I think those who come out one way or another and kind of make a fairly kind of absolute statement or blanket call and go, everyone should be doing all of this and none of that, or whatever it happens to be, do most people a bit of a disservice. It would be, in my mind at least, it would be far better if people kind of slowed down and took the time to talk about more of the nuance around how these things can be done, how they can be distributed, who needs to be doing slightly more of one and slightly less of another. If you are, again, if you're someone who has just been spending the last 10 years of your life doing predominantly low intensity aerobic work, and you've got a massive aerobic base, do you need to do more of it? Probably not. So you can start to shift the balance more towards maybe doing something else, maybe doing more kind of high intensity intervals and more kind of power-based training. But if you're someone who is just kind of coming into physical activity, or coming back to physical activity, which I think for a lot of the women in particular that you and I would work with in their late 30s, 40s and beyond, like, they're just coming back to physical activity after 10, 20, 30 years since they've probably done it. So they might need to do a lot of rebuilding of their aerobic engine and machinery and everything else before they can then get into the high intensity work. So then that might be their focus. It's like do more of the low end, and then how do you accumulate that volume? Well, it depends. So
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think that was kind of where I wanted to go next, is in understanding some of the ways that that we might recommend people think about this, again, in application. And I appreciate that example of sort of, I love when you talk about the 7-day cycle and how we've kind of used that construct to keep ourselves organized, but at the same time, the word tyranny, like you said, comes to mind. It's like, if it doesn't fit in this 7-day cycle, then, oh my gosh, I've messed it up, or it's stressing me out. And at the same time, how do people have the sense of how to apply some of this stuff to themselves? So bringing up the idea of a more elite athlete, and if somebody is doing sort of the training that I was doing at the end of my endurance mountain biking 8-10 years, at that point I was doing a significant amount of long, lower intensity riding. To be able to ride for 12 hours, you know, you need that, and that's fine. Did I need more of that training? Not necessarily, which is why for me, when I added more interval-based training, I saw that when I had that race that I repeated. So I did a race in Orange County, 50 something miles off-road. And in the 2-year gap, I think it was, between when I did the race the first time and when I did the race the second time, the only thing I really did differently was I started lifting weights, so strength training, and I started doing more interval-based training, and I cut an hour off my time. Now, there's so many factors that go into a race result, so it's impossible to say exactly how much of that was down to the training and not other things like nutrition, mechanicals. I mean, you can just go down the road there, but I think that's kind of to your point, and this is where the messaging gets a little bit lost, is if you have that elite level endurance athlete, you have that ultra endurance athlete, you have that Ironman athlete, and then you have the folks who are trying to get back to some amount of training and realizing that walking, while wonderful, is not the same, is not going to help them necessarily build an aerobic base. How do they start working on this so that they will see improvements, and do they need it? And I think that that's what's getting lost in some of the messaging is, well, we don't need this. And it's like, hold on a second, who's this messaging really being designed for?
Well, I mean, it's interesting that you kind of say that you achieved a performance boost by switching through to strength training and high intensity interval training. In many ways, like, I don't want to confuse too many people here, but doing strength training is a form of high intensity interval training in a way, because like when you're doing squats of 30 seconds or so in length, it's like effectively 30-second intervals. Like the speed might not be as fast as what you are when you're sprinting or something along those lines, but you know, it's still a form of high intensity training in and of itself. However, you could sort of say, okay, you made that improvement by switching modes, as it were, but it was your years of the low intensity training that actually allowed you to do the high intensity work. Now, I know, you know, for myself personally, but also for people that I've worked with, is that in order to be able to get up into good high intensity territory and hold that output, whether it's a power or pace, for a certain amount of time. Let's say you're doing VO2 max type intervals, whether they're short intervals or long intervals. To create the stimulus, you have to stay up at that intensity. Well, I don't have a massive aerobic base currently, and so I would blow to smithereens really early on in that. I might get like 2 or 3 intervals, and then I'd be like, done, and shut down. And I could try and force myself to do more and more and more. And yeah, you might kind of gain, you know, 2, 3, 4 additional intervals. But really, like, it's the time at low intensity and building that aerobic base that allows you to get up to the high intensity without kind of blowing all your fuses just getting there. and then allow you to sit at that high intensity and hold it for a long period of time so that you're creating sufficient stimulus for your 4-minute interval or whatever, 6-minute interval or whatever it happened to be, so that you then get the downstream adaptations from that. And so again, you got to think of like, you need to do one to allow you to do the other. And then you can't do the other being high intensity. You can't do that very often a day because it ends up fatiguing you and drags you down. You can't do every single session of your week, month, whatever it happens to be, as a high intensity session. You blow to bits doing that. So you have to kind of come back down, unload the system. You've pushed the ceiling up. Now you're going to drag the floor up, and you just go through these repeated cycles of working on one or the other. But again, like, you know, how you go about doing that is going to come down to, you know, how much time you have available, what's the outcome that you're after, what's the result you're aiming for performance, or is it just for general health? Who knows? Like, it gets really, really difficult.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I also don't want people to think that I stopped doing any kind of lower intensity riding, because I was definitely doing that. I just took sort of a portion of what I had been doing as lower intensity and incorporated some of those higher intensities. And it's interesting. I think the other thing we didn't necessarily touch on, and you just sort of mentioned it there, is the recoverability, the amount of recovery, and the sort of even like the wear and tear that you can accumulate. The higher intensity stuff isn't sort of injury free or risk free, and maybe not so much on the bike, although you can still get hurt on the bike because just like living proof of that. But I think the interesting thing is in even technique and efficiency of movement, like movement economy. So how do you develop better movement economy, better efficiency in movement? It is at those lower intensities because you have that sort of lower risk of injury compared to, I'm going to go super hard. Maybe I'm going to go sprinting. You know, that it as being a higher intensity thing, even though it's shorter, we are seeing that form tends to break down pretty fast.
Yeah, so like I completely agree that the skill acquisition side of all of these kind of different sports and modes that, you know, we operate in, running, cycling, rowing, weightlifting, that needs to be done at a low intensity. Like, you can't, for example, be doing some sort of high intensity VO2 max interval where like you're just focusing on survival of the interval and be thinking about what is your stride length, like, are you know, what's your foot placement, like, how does this feel, how does that feel? Like, it just doesn't occur at those high intensities. And, you know, so the totality of what a lot of people are trying to achieve, they do need to do some of that work at low intensity, because then it allows them to also enhance their movement quality, their skill, you know, for, you know, kind of think about for mountain biking in particular, for some of the downhill guys, they need to learn how to read the trail or read the corner that's coming up or whatever. And like, you can't do that when you were chewing on the handlebar because you're about to die. Like, so again, like, I think we can get a little bit disingenuous when the arguments for or against a certain intensity hinged on a metabolic pathway. Like, there's just so much more to it that people need to kind of think about. And again, like, I just really encourage people to go, okay, I need to balance the high and the low in some sort of block. And if it's going to be balanced across the course of a week, the research tends to lean more in favor of doing the bulk of your volume at the lower intensity with 1 to 2 high intensity sessions a week. I present years and years ago. I presented, I think it was in Atlanta at one of the conferences there, on the recovery time required between high intensity sessions, and it's a minimum of 72 hours. So when you kind of think about, okay, you're going to do one high intensity session, you've rearranged your internal biochemistry, the body needs to kind of reset and adapt and get ready for the next stimulus. That time is about 72 hours for, for most people. So if you apply that to a week, to that 7-day cycle, you're really only going to get a couple of those sessions. And maybe during a block for some individuals, again, elite athletes where it's their job, you can really load them up. You can do a ton of those sessions. I won't say a ton of those sessions. You might just say 3 or 4 of those sessions for some athletes in some circumstances. But I think that would be a rare example, and it would only be for a very short period of time. And then you'd really unload them so that they can soak up that training and adapt. Is that applicable to your everyday person who is more focused on their health and longevity and well-being and some sort of body composition goal, losing body fat? No, like I think for those individuals, you play the longer game, which is like, can I do this week in, week out and sustain it? So in that case, you might only do 1, maybe 2 high intensity sessions a week. And then the rest of your available time is going to be some sort of mixture of the low intensity volume, but also you've got to maintain some time for the strength work and your mobility and this and this and this and that. So you've got to make it all fit somehow.
Yeah,
and it's very easy, I think, for some of those other really important aspects of your health and movement to go out the door when, like, you're so fatigued from doing a lot of high intensity work all the time.